Welcome, everyone. I'm Karin Christensen with the Newberry Library. Thank you for joining us for today's opening event for our new project, Viva la Libertad, Forming More Perfect Unions Across the Americas. If you're not familiar with the Newberry, since our founding in 1887, the library has supported and inspired research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Today, we remain dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry has recently reopened our doors to readers and visitors. You can visit our website, newberry.org, to make an appointment to do research in the reading rooms, or you can stop by the library without an appointment, Tuesday through Friday, to visit our exhibition galleries and Rosenberg Bookshop. Beginning May 1st, the galleries and bookshop will be open Saturdays as well. Today's event is the first in a series of 8 Viva la Libertad free public programs that will take place over the next year. They will bring together scholars, writers, artists, and community members to explore independent struggles across the Americas in late 18th and early 19th centuries, and to reflect on their legacies today. Looking back on the age of revolutions 200 years ago in Latin America and the United States, Viva la Libertad examines how new countries emerged from colonial rule, who gained freedom, and who was left behind, and why so many are still fighting for liberty, racial justice, and democracy. Viva la Libertad is being coordinated by the Newberry in partnership with the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, the National Museum of Mexican Art, the Instituto Justice and Leadership Academy, and Illinois Humanities. The project has been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Learn about upcoming free Viva la Libertad public programs on the project website, digital.newberry.org/libertad. You also will find information on the site about the related exhibition open now through July 24th. During the program, please enter questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom or in the comment section if you're joining us on Facebook or on YouTube. As time permits, our speakers will respond. Now I would like to introduce Will Hansen, the moderator of today's program. Will is the Newberry's Director of Reader Services and Curator of Americana. He also curated our current exhibition, Viva la Libertad, Latin America, and the Age of Revolutions. Will.
Thanks so much, Karin, and welcome everyone to our opening event. Our speakers today are coming to you from across the Americas, the ancestral and present-day lands of thousands of indigenous peoples. Here in Chicago, we acknowledge that the Newberry Library sits on the land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Miamia, Wea, Takawaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways, and we honor them to this day. We're lucky to be joined today by 6 distinguished scholars from across the Americas to discuss how liberty was understood, fought for, interpreted, and defended across the Americas, from the US to Haiti to Mexico to South America. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers for the first session of today's program. I'll introduce them all now in the order in which they will speak. So our first speaker today will be Eric Slaughter. Professor Slaughter is Associate Professor of English Language and Literature and Director of the Carla Shearer Center for the Study of American Culture, as well as Deputy Dean of the Division of Humanities at the University of Chicago. He specializes in early American cultural, intellectual, and literary history, and his scholarship focuses chiefly on transformations in political thought and behavior in the 18th century. His first book, The State as a Work of Art, The Cultural Origins of the Constitution, was published in 2009 and examined the relation of culture to politics in revolutionary America. Our second speaker will be Caitlin Fitz. Professor Fitz is Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University. She is a historian of early America in a broad and hemispheric sense. Her work explores early US engagement with foreign communities and cultures, as well as the relationship between ordinary people and formal politics. Her award-winning first book, Our Sister Republics, The United States in an Age of American Revolutions, was published in 2016 and shows how Latin America's independence wars shaped popular understandings of race, revolution, and republicanism in the United States. Fitz has also written about the hemispheric dimensions of the War of 1812, US citizens in insurgent Brazil, Iroquois communities during the US Revolution, and anti-slavery activists in Tennessee. Our third speaker will be Alfredo Avila Rueda. Professor Avila is the researcher and professor of history at the National University of Mexico, or Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, also known as UNAM, where he earned his BA and PhD. Among other distinctions, he has won the Mouse Prize, the Francisco Javier Clavijero Award, the Alfonso Caso Medal, the prize of the Mexican Committee of Historical Sciences, the National University Distinction for Young Scholars, the Richard Greenleaf Fellowship, and the Eulalio Ferrer Grant. He has taught at a variety of institutions in Mexico, Spain, the US, Argentina, and Brazil. A specialist in the history of political culture and thought in early 19th century Mexico, he has published 9 books and several journal articles and contributions for collective books. He is the president of the Mexican Committee of Historical Sciences. So now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Eric Slaughter to begin.
Thank you so much, Will. The exhibition that you put together is truly remarkable, and I'm grateful to be able to join you and my fellow distinguished panelists for this opening program. My hope is that many who are watching today will have a chance to visit the galleries in Chicago. As Will said, I study colonial British America and the early United States with a particular focus on the origins, evolution, and changing meaning of the founding documents. And my focus today is on the Declaration of Independence and anti-slavery movements in the age of the American Revolution. In the United States of America's revolutionary history, perhaps no document is more iconic than the Declaration, the short but sweeping statement issued by Congress on July 4th, 1776, severing bonds with Britain and launching the British American colonies on their path to independence. But what does the Declaration of Independence actually declare? For many today, the answer is embodied in the opening sentence of the second paragraph of the earliest printed editions. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Perhaps no sentence in US history is better known or has had a greater impact than these powerful words about equality and rights. Recently, the political philosopher Daniel Allen has brilliantly observed that we've shortchanged the original longer statement, placing a period after the pursuit of happiness and reducing a sentence, a much longer sentence, equally concerned with the collective right of the people to alter or abolish governments from 5 self-evident truths down to just 3. But the history of emphasizing the first part of the sentence over the second is long-standing and dates to the revolution itself. During the March on Washington in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. recited these words and said it was time for the nation to make good on this promissory note and to rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. 100 years earlier, in his Gettysburg Address, President Abraham Lincoln insisted that the nation had been founded upon the proposition that all men are created equal. But in 1776, that's not how most readers would have seen the Declaration. Few inside or outside of the new United States discussed these words, instead focusing on the long list of charges against King George III that dominated the body of the text, or, as historian David Armitage has demonstrated, the bold capital letters in the document's final section, declaring the colonies to be free and independent states. So why did we come to focus on the message that we did? How and when did Americans turn a diplomatic severance note, an assertion of sovereignty, into a declaration of individual rights and a philosophical statement about the natural equality of all people? While most observers at the time were focusing on other parts of the document, One set of people saw the sentence as its most important statement: opponents of slavery. To be sure, Revolutionary era abolitionists constituted a minority of the Declaration's early readers, but years later, it would be their reading that helped transform an instrument of international law into a founding document of domestic politics. In watching how these early Americans read their Declaration and what they paid attention to, we get a powerful lesson in how a seemingly clear founding document can shift meaning over the years and even hold different or multiple meanings in its own time. We also see how a state paper designed to dissolve the political bands between Britain and the colonies slowly and somewhat surprisingly came to be recognized as a founding document of American equality and as a distinctly American contribution to political systems around the world. The Declaration's rhetoric of freedom, equality, and rights entered a world in which chattel slavery was a social reality for a fifth of the population. Could I have the first slide, please? Thank you. Indeed, the first newspaper announcement printed in Philadelphia on July 2nd, 1776, that Congress had voted that the colonies be free and independent states, sat uncomfortably next to a runaway notice offering a reward for the return of an enslaved Black individual named Ishmael. To some at the time, the revolutionary talk of liberty and equality seemed almost hypocritical. How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes, unquote, asked the English dictionary maker Samuel Johnson in his reply to some of the earliest declarations of rights emerging from the Continental Congress. May I have the next slide, please? Still others, like the European artist who imagined this fanciful depiction of the pulling down of the royal statue of George III in New York, which is in the exhibit, may have believed or even feared that claims of liberty and equality trumped those of property, and that whites and Blacks were now working together for the downfall of both political monarchy and chattel slavery. Next slide, please. Almost no one at the time beyond Congress would have known that the original rough draft of the Declaration had concluded its long list of charges against the king by asserting that he had, quote, declared cruel war against human nature itself, unquote, by enabling the slave trade, a passage that made clear in its capital manuscript letters that enslaved Africans were men. The same king responsible for allowing slavery was also to be charged here with acting as an opportunistic emancipator, freeing enslaved people who came over to the British side. Jefferson grumbled to some friends that congressional delegates from the Deep South found support from certain colonists in the North whose economies were leveraged in the slave trade in order to defeat and delete this charge from the published version of the Declaration. Next slide, please. But even without that passage, to members of the small anti-slavery movement at the time, the language of the Declaration must have arrived as a blessing, a national document signed by some of America's leading citizens that included a claim that all men are created equal. Almost immediately, it seems, anti-slavery activists such as Lemuel Haynes of Massachusetts incorporated those words into their arguments against slavery. Haynes had a Black father and a white mother and called himself a mulatto. He had experienced life as an indentured servant and as a soldier, but never as a slave. And he embraced the key sentence as an epigraph for a manuscript he had been working on with the title of Liberty Further Extended, or Free Thoughts on the Illegality of Slave Keeping. There, on the bottom of his manuscript title page, he cited the words of Congress. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Haynes's essay was not published in his lifetime, but he was part of a bigger social and political movement, and other similar uses of the phrase did see print. Next slide, please. In 1783, David Cooper of New Jersey published an address directed to the rulers of America in the Continental Congress on the inconsistency of slavery in a land of liberty, using the second paragraph of the Declaration to hold them to account. Could Congress, he asked, have truly meant only the rights of white men and not of all men? Next slide, please. Formal abolitionist societies in Pennsylvania in 1788, in Maryland in 1791, and New Jersey in 1793 all worked the sentence into the constitutions of their organizations and placed them as here. Oh, I think this is the next slide. Perhaps go back one. Oh, never mind. Abolitionist sympathizers in Congress invoked the sentence on the floor of the new House of Representatives in 1790, even though the Constitution itself denied Congress the power to prohibit the migration and importation of slaves before 1808. By 1792, when almanac maker Benjamin Banneker, an African-American, quoted the true and invaluable doctrine that all men are created equal back to Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson in an exchange of letters reprinted in papers across the new nation, abolitionists had been working for a decade and a half to make Americans identify the Declaration of Independence with the cause of enslaved people. The Declaration itself began to take on its iconic status in the early 19th century as the nation emerged from a second war with Britain and as revolutions in Latin America led to the creation of new declarations of independence. Next slide, please. Okay, here's the New Jersey Abolition Society with the epigraph like Haynes of the Declaration. Final slide now, please. Early in the 1820s, Congress authorized the production of a facsimile of the engrossed parchment copy, and by the time of the Declaration's Jubilee in 1826, it was not just abolitionists who were invoking the self-evident truths of the second paragraph as a founding creed of the nation. As the Declaration began to assume greater prominence, these powerful words spread beyond the abolitionist movement, inspiring groups of men and women to draft declarations of their own. Working men called for greater protections of the inalienable rights of workers in the 1820s. More famously, advocates for women's rights in Seneca Falls in 1848 declared that all men and women are created equal. In the almost 250 years since it was signed, the claims of equality and rights in the Declaration of Independence have come to be seen as a major contribution to world politics, imported sometimes wholesale into the declarations of other nation states. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789, drafted while Jefferson was in Paris, was one of the first to follow in the Declaration's wake, and you can see a wonderful calligraphed copy in the exhibit. It opens with the claim that all men are born free and remain equal in rights. But at the time, very few in the newly united states, besides a small contingent of Black and white anti-slavery activists, would have seen the Declaration as a document of radical egalitarianism or even as a founding document. That we do so now is a testament in part to their efforts and to generations of readers since who have pressed the United States to live up to those words. It is truly their declaration, rather than Jefferson's or Congress's, that so many read and celebrate today. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. I am really honored to be a part of this forum and to be involved with Newberry's exhibition, which, like Eric said, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at virtually, I encourage you to do so because we are right in the thick of the 200th anniversary of Latin America's independence wars. And here in the US, we're approaching our own 250th anniversary. So it's just a really opportune time to be grappling with that revolutionary legacy. Now, I am primarily a historian of the United States, but I'm interested in how Latin American independence shaped popular thinking about race and revolution and equality in the United States. And so I wanted to use my opening comments to build on what Eric was talking about and suggest that if we look ahead a little bit to the 1810s and 1820s, Spanish America's new republics also helped anti-slavery activists in the US to strengthen that more egalitarian reading or interpretation of the Declaration. And this is interesting to me because when historians of US Latin American relations are sort of framing their work, we often think in terms of US influence on Latin America, which is itself an interesting question and story. But I think it's also important that we think about the reverse and about Latin America's influence on the US, not just in terms of, say, economics and labor and migration, but also in terms of political history and intellectual history. And so I want to just talk a little bit about Spanish Americans' influence on anti-slavery thinking of the sort of kind that Eric started us off with during this revolutionary era. And so I'd like to start by just invoking the way that the Newberry exhibition has framed the inter-American Revolutionary Age as a half century that stretched from the shot heard round the world in 1775 through the independence of Spanish America by about 1825, because during that half century, most of the Western Hemisphere was politically independent from Europe. But here's the thing, by the end of that period, 1825 or so, the US was also the only American republic in which slavery was expanding rather than receding. I actually was just on a podcast where they gave me 60 seconds to talk about the one thing that I wish more people knew or understood about early American history. And that was my thing, right? That by 1825, the US was the only republic in the Western Hemisphere where slavery was growing rather than declining, because the only other places where slavery was growing were Brazil, which had declared independence as a monarchy, not as a republic, in the early 1820s, and then colonial Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so that means that aside from the US, all of the hemisphere's other independent republics were various degrees of anti-slavery. You have abolitionist Haiti, of course, which declared independence in 1804. And then you have independent or mainland Spanish America, where you see different kinds of usually very gradual, often quite limited anti-slavery measures that unfolded over the course of decades. Spanish America's new republics also tended to grant citizenship to freemen of color, and they at least, in many cases, paid lip service to a sort of multiracial nationalism. And I want to really emphasize here that these changes were fiercely contested throughout Spanish America, because there is this myth that in many ways dates back to this era, that Latin America was like a racial democracy. So I want to be really clear on this point, that Spanish America's republics were far from racial democracies. Slavery persisted in places through the 1840s into the 1850s, to say nothing of racism. So my point for now is just that slavery was declining in those republics, in contrast to the US, where it was skyrocketing dramatically. And this isn't just me looking back and identifying this trend with 200 years of hindsight, because US newspapers reported widely on these different trajectories. So if we could go to the first slide, please, I'll just show you two quick examples. The first example is from a major anti-slavery newspaper called, as you can see here, The Genius of Universal Emancipation. It was edited by the white Quaker Benjamin Lundy, whose picture I've sort of awkwardly superimposed in the corner there, just so that you can put a face to the name. Lundy reported on Latin America in well over half of his issues in the decade of the 1820s. And so he's just repeatedly reporting on Spanish American anti-slavery, and just as repeatedly, he's urging the United States to catch up and follow Spanish Americans' example. And he really resembles those anti-slavery activists that Eric mentioned earlier, because one of his key goals is to elevate that egalitarian language from the Declaration of Independence. So just to give one of many examples, on July 4th of 1822, Lundy asks his readers if the US will ever make good on that egalitarian language in the Declaration by ending slavery. And then he answers his own question. And the way he answers it is by looking abroad. Here's what he says. He says, if we permit the people of Haiti and those of Colombia to answer, they will tell us that if we had the will to end slavery, we might easily accomplish it. So basically, Lundy is using repeatedly Haitian and Spanish American independence to strengthen his own egalitarian interpretation of the Declaration, right? He's reminding readers that everywhere else, American republics were also, in varying degrees, anti-slavery. And just as one interesting measure of how central Latin America was to Lundy's vision, we can look at the paper's masthead. So if you look in this slide, you can see that Lundy has taken that egalitarian language from the Declaration and put it front and center. It's in every one of his mastheads. But then look how he attributes it to the Declaration Independence US. So why would he put the US there? Why not just say Declaration of Independence? Well, because he knew that there were declarations of independence throughout the hemisphere. I mean, he's talking about them in most of his issues. So he puts it there because he wants to clarify or emphasize that he's talking about the US Declaration as it fit into this broader hemispheric landscape. A second quick example of Latin America's importance to US egalitarian thought, if we could go to the next slide, please, is from another anti-slavery newspaper called Freedom's Journal. This was actually the first Black-owned and edited newspaper in all of American history. It's published out of New York City, and you can see its editors there, John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish. So they also talked about Latin America in over half of their issues. And in fact, in the very first column of the very first issue, which you can see the top part of right here, when they're explaining why they wanted to publish this newspaper, why they thought it was necessary, what their vision is and their goal, as part of that, they talk about Latin America and how it shaped their understanding. So as you can see here, they say, has the eternal decree gone forth that our race alone are to remain in this state while knowledge and civilization are shedding their enlivening rays over the rest of the human family? And of course, their answer is no. And as evidence, they turn to the establishment of the Republic of Haiti and the advancement of liberal ideas in South America, where despotism has given place to free governments and where many of our brethren now fill important civil and military stations. So they're embracing the other independent republics of South America as egalitarian inspirations. And it's not just anti-slavery activists who think in these sort of hemispheric terms. If we could just go to the next slide, please. This is the Kentucky congressman and slaveholder, Henry Clay. So in 1820, right in the heat of the Missouri crisis, when the nation is kind of on verge of splitting into two on the issue of slavery, Henry Clay stands on the floor of Congress, and he actually says, as you can see here, in some particulars, the people of South America were in advance of us. Grenada, by which he means Colombia, Venezuela, and Buenos Aires had all emancipated their slaves. Now, this particular image is from the Newberry's exhibition, and if you were in person, you could actually read the handwriting on the document that Clay is holding there. It's actually a copy of an 1821 House resolution that Clay successfully sponsored in support of Spanish American independence. So by posing for this portrait with this House resolution, Clay was really showing just how central Spanish American independence was to his own political identity, anti-slavery and all. Now, there's a lot of context to give here because Clay was no racial egalitarian. I mean, he did not believe in multiracial republics, but he's clearly looking to Latin America as he thinks about what kinds of nations American republics might aspire to be or might become. So I think I'll stop there, knowing full well that I've just scratched the surface, because if this anti-slavery rhetoric is part of our heritage, so are the pro-slavery and settler colonial impulses that came out of the revolution as well. So this gap between our egalitarian rhetoric and our unequal reality is something that the US really has reckoned with from the beginning. And so I will look forward to conversation and questions. Thank you.
Hi, hello. Thanks, Elizabeth, Will, and the people of the Newberry Library. It's a pleasure to be here with Eric, Caitlin, as part of this amazing exhibition, talking with you about Latin American revolutions. We are in 2021 and we are celebrating the bicentennial of our independence. In 1821, in Lima, Caracas, Guatemala City, and Mexico City, among other places, freedom was proclaimed. For long years, historians explained the process of independence of their own countries from their own view. Mexicans only studied Mexico without paying attention to what was happening in Colombia or Central America, as if the events in Peru or Chile were unique, unrelated to Spain, the United States, Cuba, or Haiti. Since the 1990s, this has changed. Historians increased the point of view. The great Argentinian historian Tulio Alperin said that with the national independences also happened the dissolution of the Spanish monarchy. The great Spanish monarchy was an enormous empire ruling over more than 25 million people in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The first slide, please. For the 3 centuries, silver from Peru, Alto Peru, now Bolivia and Mexico, fueled the economies of China and other Pacific countries, enriched European financiers and Spanish merchants, and empowered Spain. But at the beginning of the 19th century, the world was changing. The Industrial Revolution changed the global economy. Revolutions in the United States, France, and Haiti spawned new ideas of freedom. Still, they also spurred slavery in many places, from the Chesapeake Bay to Buenos Aires. Spain was not prepared for these challenges. The Spanish monarchy, the great Spanish monarchy, was in crisis. It relied on France, but in 1808, Napoleon decided to take the government of the Iberian Peninsula in his hands and appropriate the enormous wealth of their colonies. The second slide, please. Well, my presentation is, you can see the parts of my presentation in this slide. I must say that the people of Spain fought for their own independence in 1880. In 1808, 2 years later, Spanish patriots met a Congress in Cadiz, the only city that was not under the control of French troops. They invited the people of Spanish America to send delegates. It's a great news for Spanish Americans, but you know, maybe the Spaniards politicals didn't do it to give them rights. Spain needed support to continue the war, and the silver came mainly from Peru and Mexico. So you need invite the Mexicans and the Peruvians. In 1812, the deputies proclaimed a liberal constitution. They abolished the Inquisition and established freedom of the press. For the first time in many countries, they provide a separation of powers in 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The Constitution mandated that there be elections everywhere. Spaniards and indigenous people will be considered citizens. The citizenship under the Constitution of Spain included indigenous people. It's a very important model. All males in those groups could vote. And as you could imagine, women had no political rights. Municipal elections were organized in each town with more than 1,000 inhabitants. For the first time, the ordinary people of Lima and Mexico City voted to elect their authorities. Incredibly, the elections were very participatory and contested. For the first time, newspapers addressed political issues. In places where the authorities forbade their rights, people demanded them. In Spain, the liberals fought for Napoleon for independence and made a constitution. They did not really realize that their ideas of freedom spread over the people of Spanish America. Beginning in 1810, from Rio de la Plata to New Spain, people gathered to fight for liberty. It was not clear whether the effort was to liberate the Spanish monarchy from Napoleonic rule or liberate American provinces from Spanish rule. The war spread everywhere. In Mexico, some parish priests led the rebels in defense of religion and in defense of the patria, the fatherland. The Spanish authorities organized militias in the villages to combat the insurgentes, the rebels. It became a civil war. The wars of independence in Latin America were civil wars. In the decisive Battle of Puente de Calderón, by example, in 1811, Miguel Hidalgo, the father of el padre de la patria, the Mexican padre de la patria, led an army of indigenous people, mestizo rancheros, peasant workers, and Creole militias. But on the other side, the royalist commander, Felix Maria Calleja, led an army of Creole militias, mestizo ranchers, and peasants, the same thing. In Buenos Aires, the Creoles decided to disobey the Spanish government. They demanded that the other provinces of the Rio de la Plata obey the government junta of the city. But some provinces refused to. There was a war in which some fought for Spain, but all fought for self-determination. The same happened elsewhere. The Cartagena people did not want to depend on Spain, but neither did they like to submit to Santa Fe de Bogotá. In Venezuela was established a federal constitution, inspired in the USA, but Maracaibo did not want to exchange Spanish rule for Caracas rule. The Spanish government took advantage of these fractures. From Peru, Viceroy Abascal sent militias, Creole militias, to fight the Creole militias of the Rio de la Plata. In Venezuela and New Granada, Spanish armies offered freedom to slaves who fought for Spain. Most of the patriots of Caracas were white landowners and slave owners. At first, remember, Simón Bolívar fought for his freedom, but not for the freedom of the Afro-descendant people. The war and the new ideas brought about changes. In Mexico, the patriots abolished tribute, segregation, and slavery. In 1813, the Mexican Congress ensured that all people had the same rights, but again, women remained excluded. The Declaration of Independence was inspired in the Declaration and the Constitution of the United States, but also in Spanish liberal thought. The war also affected gender relations. Many women helped the guerrillas. In some villages, when the men went to war, the women led the community and the production. In some places, they also achieved independence, their own independence. They become rancheras in the Mexican Bajío. Sadly, as you can imagine, the violence of war also increased domestic violence and violence against women. In the small towns of Guanajuato, Colonel Agustín de Iturbide arrested dozens of women and transferred them with stocks and chains to prison without charges. What was their crime? Being mothers, daughters, or girlfriends of guerrilla men. The war gave the military a lot of power. Between 1814 and 1819, the king restored absolutism. Spain sent reconquest expedition that established militarized governments in much of the American continent. The viceroys lost control, while the commanders became the actual rulers. In 1820, the Spanish troops, who had to go to Venezuela to fight Bolívar, decided to fight against the king. Again, a liberal government was formed in Spain. In Caracas, Lima, and Mexico City, the Spanish military did not want to establish a constitution, but they had no alternative. Some of them wanted to attract the patriots to end the war. The next slide, please. They claimed, the royalist army claimed, that there was already a freedom in Spain, so that the patriots had no reasons to fight. By example, this is three phrases, the three quotes of a letter of a royalist chief, Gabriel de Armijo, that say, the Spanish Constitution, the Sacred Code, declares that we are all equal without distinction of European and American Spaniards. But the Mexican leader, the Mexican rebel leader, Vicente Guerrero, answered, how should I accept if I am excluded from the right of citizenship in my own country? Vicente Guerrero was an Afro-descendant, and the Constitution gave rights to Spaniards and indigenous people, but not to people of African ascendant. It's interesting because months later, Vicente Guerrero joined Iturbide, the same Agustín de Iturbide, who furthered the Spanish liberal order to achieve independence. In 1823, as in other parts of Spanish America, Mexico became a republic. In 1829, that man, Vicente Guerrero, became president. He faced the last attempt at the Spanish reconquest, organized with the support of Cuban slave owners. He fought for Mexican independence, but also for freedom of ordinary people. In September 15, in the commemoration of independence, Vicente Guerrero abolished the slavery in Mexico. And this was the culmination of the process that he protagonized since years later. So thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
Okay. Thank you to Alfredo and Caitlin and Eric for three really rich, wonderful introductions to this area. There's so many threads that tie these three talks together that we could discuss. If Caitlin and Eric and Alfredo want to turn your videos on, we can start having a discussion. If audience members want to put questions in the Q&A, if questions occur to you, please put them in there and we'll start discussing. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and start with one of my own to get us started. I think we'll start maybe with a discussion about republicanism and Republican forms of government, which all three of your talks discussed from various angles. Particularly the sort of differences, the similarities, the surprises, the limitations of different forms of Republican government across the Americas, and particularly between the US and Spanish or Latin America. What sort of connections and differences do the three of you see from your different perspectives in how Republican government was adapted and changed from these various areas? Whoever wants to start, really. Caitlin, you might.
Maybe I'll jump in because
Yeah,
I was as surprised as I think the listeners of the podcast that Caitlin just gave were about the fact that the United States was the sole republic in 1820 in which the practice of slavery was expanding. And I think, you know, it shows my blind spots as somebody who studies the early United States less in a kind of global context than I probably should. But I think, you know, one thing I try to talk about with my students is a topic that came up in Alfredo's talk, which is the question of how the equality claims in these founding documents become constitutionalized. And you saw it in that 1820 letter that Alfredo showed us. You see it in all sorts of state constitutions, the Massachusetts state constitution, which you know, declares all men are born free and equal, and consequently a judicial decision decides that slavery is therefore illegal. The Vermont Constitution, which in the late 1770s will say all men are born free and equal, and therefore there cannot be slavery. So you see all sorts of different kinds of understandings about what the claims of equality might mean, what kind of consequences they might mean. And you see other accommodations in places like Virginia to sort of carve out an exception for enslaved individuals. So I don't really have a great answer for you, and I'm actually interested in hearing what Caitlin and Alfredo have to say. But I do think that local circumstances and how republicanism is understood on the ground in different locations, even within a single nation, makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that your comments made me think about, Eric, was, and Alfredo's opening comments, was about how contingent these constitutional promises and rights are on the ground. And so I'm thinking of Marisa Lasso's work about how the Spanish Constitution of 1812, from the Spanish Cortes in Cádiz, actually did not count African-descended Spanish Americans towards representation in the Spanish Congress, which Spanish Americans were upset about, because if they didn't count people of African descent in their representation, that would have lowered their representation and therefore their political power. And so that's one of the reasons that you see in parts of Spanish America, these independent republics start to make a push to count people of African descent. It's not necessarily because white Spanish Americans are always coming from a place of believing in equality for equality's sake. It's part of the sort of political calculus in response to what's happening in Spain and in response to what's happening on the ground. And I guess, the sort of big picture because that's one way to talk about difference in republicanism. But I also want to think a little more broadly too about the narrative we tell about republicanism in the Western Hemisphere, because I think we have maybe a stereotype of Spanish American politics as just being full of coups and caudillos. And I don't think that entirely bears out. I mean, there was tons of political turmoil in the 19th century Americas, and I mean, throughout the world. I mean, making a republic, sustaining a republic was hard. And there was political violence everywhere that tried it. So if you think about the US, there are political duels, there are congressmen beating each other up on the floor of Congress. Think about how close the nation came to falling apart in the 1780s, or if you think about the Civil War in the 1860s as a manifestation of massive political violence that in part resulted from the revolutionary generation's compromises on the issue of slavery. So it's not that you didn't ask this question, Will, but I guess I'm saying, if we think about, republicanism as something that created that kind of instability throughout the Western Hemisphere, not just in Spanish America, but also in the United States. I mean, the big picture is that, I would kind of not draw a contrast between US stability and Spanish American instability. I would just emphasize that republics were hard. And if you think about Europe also has republican revolutions in this period. The French Revolution, revolutions of 1830, 1848, and those republics do not sustain. So by that standard, Latin American republicanism was actually pretty resilient if we judge it by the standards of the 19th century and not by our own standards today.
Well, I agree with Caitlin. A few years ago, Hilda Sabato published a great book, Republics of the New World, and she showed that the Republican order in Spanish America is not different of the Republican order in other countries. In Mexico, in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, Chile, Peru, there was established republics with the same problems of the other ones. Even in Europe, Spain, Portugal, Naples, France was had a very conflictive 19th century, you know, with revolutions and restorations in different times. But for the answer of the question, there are similarities in Venezuela in 1810 or Mexico and Central America in the 20s. There was established confederations, just like the Articles of Confederation in the US. It's very fragile confederations, and in Mexico and in Central America, they fought in 10 years later, they was established because and Central America did not survive the Republic. And we now can see in Central America different republics that originally were provinces or states of a federal union, of a federal republic. And in contrast, Simón Bolívar, that were a federalist in the 1810, became a centralist and more militarist governor in the 20s. And the Constitution of Bolivia is a republican constitution, but with the president from all the life, and practically is a monarchy. And he reject the republican principles. And the problem is how to govern the new republics. It's the first step is freedom. The second step is government. And the problem of the government is a problem that was faced in everywhere, in Latin America, but in Europe and in the United States too.
Great. Thank you all for those thoughts. I think we could probably keep going on this, but I want to get to the questions that audience members have put in. Our first one from our friends at the Haitian American Museum of Chicago here, who have a question that will sort of tie together the two panels. A question about how the Haitian Declaration might have shaped the changing meaning of the U.S. Declaration. They point out that Eric has already highlighted how abolitionist journals and figures like Benjamin Banneker were pushing for a different understanding of American freedom. But they point out that the Haitian Declaration of Independence is very distinct, and it doesn't borrow from Jefferson's language to expand that definition. Eric, do you want to start by commenting on that?
Sure, I can start, but I have a feeling Caitlin right now and certainly Laurent Dubois later this afternoon will have much more to say about this. No, it is extraordinary how little the Haitian Declaration depends upon the kind of rights language of the U.S. Declaration. It does, I think, embody that kind of declaration of national sovereignty that you see and that David Armitage has described as characteristic of the genre. He reminds us that it is a declaration of independence and not a declaration of rights that we're talking about. And we've sort of melded those genres together. What's also very prominent in the Haitian Declaration is this kind of renunciation, the oath of renunciation against France forever, that you find somewhat at the end of the U.S. Declaration, but without the kind of incredible rhetoric that you see in the Haitian document. So I mean, I can say just formally they don't resemble each other, but the questioner has already pointed that out. So the question of the influence of the Haitian Declaration upon American anti-slavery is a topic I leave to Caitlin.
Well, I in turn would defer to whatever Laurent says in the next part of the panel, but I'm happy to give a little bit of my sort of broad take on this question. I guess the parallel I would draw is that in the same way that the anti-slavery activists that Eric talked about reinterpreted the US Declaration of Independence and really changed the meaning of it by focusing audiences' attention on that language of inalienable rights and self-evident truths. Haitian revolutionaries were also strategically taking some of the language coming from the French Revolution and universalizing it in a new way that had groundbreaking implications for, I mean, really like what we might recognize as a sort of modern understanding of human rights. Not that they needed the French Revolution to make those arguments or to know that slavery was wrong, but that was like a political opportunity for them to hold French revolutionaries up to their word. And so I think there's a way in which the Haitian Revolution is taking some of that language and universalizing it, at least for men, as Alfredo pointed out. And so I think there's kind of a parallel with what Eric was talking about within the United States. I mean, I think that's sort of the Haitian Revolution. One of its big contributions to world history is the way in which it kind of energized this modern notion of human rights that then became really central to US abolitionism, to Spanish American and Brazilian anti-slavery activists. It's, I mean, you know, we think of like Lexington and Concord as the shot heard around the world, but in a way, the Haitian Revolution has that same kind of global power in our history of equality and human rights.
Oh, yes, but I must say that the 80 revolution and the 80 Declaration of Independence caused a lot of fear in Creole elites in Latin America. They were afraid of a social revolution, and the terror, the newspapers published the horrors of the revolution in Haiti, and it was a discourse that stopped any attempt to make a revolution, a racial revolution in Latin America. An example, in 1813, in now it's Acapulco, the region of Acapulco in Mexico, a man would promote a revolution against Spain, but against the Creoles. And Jose Maria Morelos, the Mexican leader of independence, say no. And he say, los negros no deben mandar. Black people no did not to command the war. So it's okay. Morelos promote the abolition of slavery, promote the abolition of the distinctions of race, but he preferred an order, a rule of Mexican white people.
Thank you all. So we've got a couple other questions here. Let's go to Jeff's next. So Jeff asks, although the Spanish Constitution did not recognize people of African descent to be citizens, I believe in all liberated Latin American republics, they did after they achieved their independence. So he's asking, is this correct? And were African Latin Americans able to exercise the franchise? Probably best to go to Alfredo first for this one.
Yes. Well, exactly. The Constitution of Cadiz did not recognize any right to African descendant people. It's a political issue, you know. If in America lived 12 million of people in Latin America, and in Spain 10 million. If you have a Congress with a representation of the American and the Spanish, so the Congress will be with majority of Spanish America. So one way to limit the representation of Spanish America were not count the African descendant people. And Venezuela, by example, has the right to 4 deputies in the Cortes, but with the exclusion of the African descendant, only 1 deputy could assist to the Cortes, to the parliament. So it's a political issue. But I forgot the principal item in the political thought of the liberalism in Spain and the revolutions in Latin America: religion, the Catholic religion. Latin American had constitutions that established that the only recognized religion were the Catholic. And the Catholic ethos is very important to define the citizenship. By example, a difference of other countries, in Latin America, you could be a citizen and with no problems if you have not money or have no property. But if you are a good man, good Catholic, a good vecino, you will be a citizen. So the Catholic ethos is very important in the definition of citizenship in Latin America.
Also a great point, also another dimension we had not gotten to yet. So thanks for bringing that up, Alfredo. Let's do one last question because we're at 1 o'clock and we want to have a little bit of space in between the two panels to get set up for panel 2. A question from Mimi about Anglophone and Hispanophone ideals of multiracial democracy and equality. We've touched on this a little bit, but any further comments on in what way they are culturally different and similar, those ideals? Whoever wants to start on this one.
I'm happy to offer one thought about, I guess I'll start with Spanish America, right? A place like Gran Colombia, which is, much of what's now northern South America, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama. And I'm drawing here on Marixa Lasso's work, which I've already referenced once, because there's a way in which the formal kind of nationalist rhetoric coming from Gran Colombia, because of the sort of political activism of pardos, free people of color, that it's saying essentially that, that racism is un-Colombian, that racism is a relic of the Spanish royalist past and those old colonial hierarchies, and we're moving beyond it. But there's a way in which once that becomes the formal rhetoric, it becomes hard for people of color to push against, because white Colombians still retained a disproportionate amount of political power. And so then when people of color in Colombia complained about continued racial prejudice, white Colombians could look at them and say, nope, there's no racism here. Would you please stop fomenting race war? And so there's a way in which that kind of rhetoric actually stifled kind of open organization and progress. Whereas in the United States, there is no kind of nationalist rhetoric coming from the federal government about multiracial equality, which in a weird way kind of creates a space, especially given the sort of public and print culture in US cities, where anti-slavery activists do have room to organize and push against this sort of the increasingly open non-egalitarian rhetoric coming out of the United States. So it's, each system, for lack of a better word, had its own kind of opportunities and its own challenges for people who were pressing for racial equality in this period.
Maybe I'll go next and just make two very quick points that build on the remarks that Alfredo and Caitlin have just made. The first concerns just the non-progressive narrative, I think, that we need to adopt in thinking about, how any of these places becomes a multiracial democracy. By 1820, when Alfredo is describing the constitution that he's been speaking about, free Blacks in New York State and New York City had been recognized as voters and had been already subject to new restrictions and burdens on their ability to vote. Effectively, the first voter ID law was passed in the middle of the 1810s, in particular to restrict Black voters who tended to vote for the Federalist Party rather than the Democratic Republican Party, and the Democratic Republican Party was in power. So there was, so in sort of telling the story of how one gets to a multiracial democracy, we have to understand the various twists and turns. The second thing, going back to the question of the importance of Haiti, one thing that you'll have noticed in the many quotations from the Declaration that I showed you, or that Caitlin showed you, the Declaration, the US Declaration of Independence, as Benjamin Lundy would put it, is that it stops after the pursuit of happiness and doesn't go on to say that, you know, the people have the right to alter or abolish governments, in part because the specter of a slave-based revolution after Haiti really does haunt, before and after Haiti, really does haunt the use of that paragraph. I can only think of one African-American writer, David Walker, who at the end of the 1820s in Boston is quoting the entire paragraph to explain the consequences of what the Declaration of Independence means. But very few are willing to go there. But in any event, I'll stop.
Thank you all so much. I think this was a really wonderful conversation and presentation by all three of you. So thanks to Eric, Caitlin, and Alfredo for joining us. And thank you all for joining for session 1 of today's program. So we'll begin session 2 at 1:15, and I hope you all can join us then. Thanks very much. Okay, welcome back, everyone. If you have just tuned in, I'm Will Hansen with the Newberry Library, and welcome to session 2 of our opening event for Viva la Libertad. Thanks for joining us. Let me introduce the speakers for this second section, Laurent Dubois, Kayla Grimberg, and Cristina Soriano. So our first speaker for the second session will be Laurent Dubois. Professor Dubois is the newly appointed John L. Now III Bicentennial Professor in the History and Principles of Democracy and co-director for academic affairs of the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia. Dubois is a specialist on the history and culture of the Atlantic world who studies the Caribbean, particularly Haiti, North America, and France. He is the author of 7 books, including Avengers of the New World, The Story of the Haitian Revolution, and A Colony of Citizens, Revolution and Slave Emancipation in the French Caribbean, 1787 to 1804, both published in 2004. A Colony of Citizens won the Frederick Douglass Prize and 3 other book prizes. His 2012 book, Haiti, The Aftershocks of History, was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. He has also written extensively about the politics of soccer and the cultural history of music, including his 2016 book, The Banjo, America's African Instrument. Before moving to the University of Virginia this year, Dubois spent a decade at Duke University. Our second speaker will be Cristina Soriano. Professor Soriano is Associate Professor of Latin American History at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. Soriano's research has focused on the analysis of dynamics of circulation of information, social networks, political mobilization, and the public sphere in the Spanish Caribbean during the Age of Revolutions. Her research has been supported by the Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the John Carter Brown Library, the Albert R. LePage Professorship in History, the Wissenschaft College of Berlin, the National Center of Humanities, and the Latin American and Iberian Institute of the University of New Mexico. Her first book, Tides of Revolution, Information, Insurgencies, and the Crisis of Colonial Rule in Venezuela, was published in 2018 with the University of New Mexico Press and received the 2019 Bolton Johnson Award for the Best English Language Book in Latin American History by the Conference of Latin American History, and the 2020 Fernando Coronil Prize for Best Book about Venezuela. She has published articles in a number of scholarly journals. She is currently co-editing the Cambridge Companion to Latin American Independence and working on a new project on the effects of imperial transitions on the island of Trinidad. Our third speaker will be Dr. Kayla Grimberg. Professor Grimberg is a professor of the Department of History and director of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. She joined Pittsburgh in January of 2021, after 20 years as the professor of history at the Universidade Federal do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, or UniRio. As a specialist on slavery and race in the Atlantic world, she has authored, co-authored, and edited several books, chapters, and articles, including A Black Jurist in a Slave Society, Antonio Pereira Rebusas, and the Trials of Brazilian Citizenship in 2019. She also co-directs the public digital history project Present Pasts, Memories of Slavery in Brazil. And with that, I will turn it over to Laurent to get us started.
Thank you so much, Will. It's great to be here today. And I just want to thank you and everybody at the Newberry both for inviting us today and for this amazing work that you've done putting together this exhibit and all these programs. I think it's such an important discussion to be having, and so many ways in which this history helps us understand our present in different ways. I'm going to go ahead and attempt to share my screen. So I wanted today do just some conversation about the history of Haiti. I thought the conversation in the earlier panel was wonderful, and so these issues have already been brought up brilliantly by Caitlin and Eric, and so I'm going to build on that a bit, or for those of you who are just joining, give a certain introduction. And I want to start actually with this map, which is an incredible map that's in the exhibit. I hope those of you who can go see it can go see. This is a map showing the movement of a particularly important player in the Haitian Revolution, Rochambeau, and his movements across different parts of the Atlantic. But it's a way to sort of first situate Haiti, obviously there in the lower next to Cuba in that Caribbean portion. But the point I want to make partly about this map is just the extent to which really the major movement, although we think a lot of the European Caribbean movement, of course, most people who end up in Haiti at the time of the revolution had traveled across the Atlantic from West Africa and even more from Central Africa. So they're moving across from Africa. That's the place from which the kind of population that's really going to carry out the Haitian Revolution comes to the largest extent. As many as 1 million exports or imports into Saint-Domingue, the French colony, over the 18th century. About 90% of the population of Haiti at the time of the revolution, the beginning, was enslaved, and about 2/3 of those were African-born. So this is really an event in which African-born people who had grown up in West and Central Africa, play a really fundamental role, and understanding their perspectives and history is really key to understanding the Haitian Revolution. If we can move to the second slide of Le Cap. So this is a beautiful image of Le Cap, which is the major port in the north of Haiti, the port to which many of these Africans, or a majority of them, would have arrived during the course of the 18th century. So this kind of location, which was in 1723, was really just getting off the ground. This incredible boom in the plantation agriculture of Saint-Domingue in the 18th century created what became the most profitable colony in the Americas, primarily through sugar production and also coffee production. The Haitian Revolution has to be understood, I think, as the first Latin American revolution. It's obviously the second independent nation in the Americas, but I think thinking of it in relation to Latin American revolutions is really vital. But the key about the revolution was that it kind of intertwined emancipation and independence from the start. And in fact, it's really the struggle for emancipation and for freedom that drives the revolution. And it's only in a sense when that freedom gets threatened by France, which is at first a kind of an ally in that process of emancipation, the French Republic. It's when kind of freedom, it becomes necessary to become independent, to retain freedom and to save freedom, that Haitian independence happens. So it's a kind of two-stage process, and I'm going to try to just explain that a little bit as part of the conversation here today. If we can go to the next slide. Actually, yes, this one, that would be great, thanks. So this is a kind of, I think, a powerful image that gives us a sense of kind of the key moment, the founding moment, which is in 1791, when there's a huge uprising of enslaved people in the northern part of Saint-Domingue, so around that port of Le Cap that we saw before. And what you see here is an image in which each of those plumes of flames is one sugar plantation. And again, to reiterate, these sugar plantations were incredibly profitable, large industrial spaces in which sugar production was going on. And what you can see is that the insurgents really sort of systematically attacked each of them, set them alight. And it really was an attack against that plantation system, a very furious and intense one that happened in 1791. And this set in motion a process that culminated then in 1793. And if we can go to the next image, in 1793, when an alliance between insurgents and certain French Republicans led to the actual abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue in 1793. This is an image that's actually from the Duke Archives. I believe the link is in the chat, recently acquired by Duke University Libraries. And it's a very fascinating image. I urge you to go look at it. You can explore the details because it shows this kind of incredible moment of transformation and all those involved. The key that I just want to leave you with here is that in some ways, you can think of the Haitian Revolution as the shortest and most successful abolitionist movement in history, started in 1791, culminated in 1793, with the full and complete abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue, something that was then ratified by the National Convention in France and actually extended to the French Empire. So it's a really remarkable story if you think about the context of the era and the comparisons with other places around it. And what happens with that change is that it sort of transforms, I think, the realm of possibility and the realm of the political imagination in the Atlantic world. Important to remember that before that, even many radical abolitionists proposed that slavery should be abolished extremely slowly over the course of many decades. The Haitian Revolution essentially puts on the stage this other possibility, which is, first of all, an abolition that's driven by the enslaved through violence, and also something that would essentially immediately abolish slavery and make the enslaved citizens, which also happened in the case of the Haitian Revolution. So it really kind of raises the bar or throws down the gauntlet, or however whatever metaphor you might want to use, and in a way that I think makes it a kind of constant referent afterwards, so that both for those who fear that outcome and those who wish for that outcome, it becomes a kind of new reference that shapes what comes afterwards. Now, what happens in the late 1790s is that this regime of emancipation is consolidated. Obviously, Toussaint Louverture, who is a well-known figure, the kind of his story is kind of intertwined with that. But then in the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte decides, as he comes to power, to try to reverse that process of emancipation. So he comes into conflict with this new leadership in the Caribbean. And really his decision to try to go back against emancipation is a very fateful one, one that he later regrets on his deathbed, in fact, that kind of leads to a whole series of transformations, because once he decides to essentially send troops to Saint-Domingue to reestablish slavery, the choice becomes literally kind of, liberty or death choice on the part of the people in Saint-Domingue, who fight against France in order to preserve the freedom that originally was actually earned in an alliance with France. And the defeat of Napoleon's troops leads to the independence of Haiti. Also, importantly for the United States, directly leads to the Louisiana Purchase, or the sale of Louisiana from France to the United States, because Napoleon's acquisition of Louisiana was entirely tied to his desire to reestablish and kind of rebuild Haiti as a slave colony. So you kind of get a sense of the kind of imperial relationships here, but I just kind of want to emphasize again that the key, I think, on this of this story is the way in which emancipation is sort of the result. Emancipation is the driver, and independence is sort of the result of a particular configuration at that time. But also, and again, building a little bit on the discussion you were having earlier in the earlier panel, the framing of Haitian independence, the declaration itself, which is, as the panelists were saying, is so different from that of the United States. First of all, that declaration is written at the end of a very, very brutal war. So if you think of the American Declaration of Independence as, in a sense, beginning a war, right, or kind of the first volley in a war in a certain sense, the Haitian Declaration comes at the end of the war. And it's really infused with the violence of that conflict and with the brutality of that conflict in many ways. And so that declaration, I think, what maybe in some of its innovations are less in the language of rights than in some ways in the symbolism of the declaration. The declaration the declaration invents a new verb, which is in French the verb lugubrer, which essentially means to kind of haunt or shadow, that describes France as still shadowing the land of Haiti. And there's a powerful symbolism that has to do, I think, in ways that continue to resonate today with what to do with the kind of histories and traumas of slavery, with how to sort of, in a sense, overcome or move beyond those traumas, even as they haunt the landscape. And I would say that in many ways, I think it's in the realm of symbolism that declaration and other aspects of Haitian Revolution sort of infuse the rest of the Atlantic. You see obviously reference to the history constantly, but also the kind of symbolism and the powerful symbolism that comes out of that revolution, I think, in a sense, haunts or circulates within Latin American independence. So with that, I'll thank you for inviting me again and hand it over to the next panelists. Thanks.
Okay, thank you to the Newberry team and everyone for organizing this amazing exhibition. And also thank you to the previous panelists, because I think they set a fantastic tone for us to begin talking about our topics in the panel. And I wanted to follow up in one idea that Alfredo Avila Rueda mentioned, which is how the Atlantic perspective and context have helped us to see the independence movement in different ways. And for me, in my own work, one of the crucial things is understanding how people back in the 18th century learned about the revolutions, how they used the language of the revolutions to kind of a trigger or give a new meaning and words to their own discontent and their own struggle for representation or equality. So I would like to begin with, by telling you these 3 short stories that I reconstructed during my archival research. And these are 3 stories that offer us like a revealing vision of the impact of the Atlantic revolutions, particularly in the Spanish Caribbean context and particularly in Venezuela. So can we see the first slide, please? There we go. Okay. So it was 1788 when a priest and a professor at the University of Caracas, José Ignacio Moreno, confessed that he owned a hand-copied version of a text entitled The Treaty of Philadelphia. He had that text and other manuscripts that represented kind of a foreign materials about the revolutions. Historians have discussed that this document, entitled The Treaty of Philadelphia, was in fact and probably a copy of the Declaration of Independence of the United States. Moreno did not believe that owning a copy of this document represented any form of transgression or challenge to colonial rule, because after all, the official newspaper, the Gaceta de Madrid, which is the one that you're seeing here, frequently informed its readers about the events developing in the North American colonies. So despite all the efforts made by colonial agents in Spanish America to contain the revolutionary information that might spark sedition and insurgency in the Spanish Caribbean, the popular official newspaper, the Gaceta, offered details and news about the Atlantic revolutions and became a constant source of concern for the colonial governments. In several issues, for example, this Gaceta de Madrid reported on the American Revolution and the political climate of the young republic. Perhaps because Spain had aided the US independence, this official newspaper presented these changes in a very positive light. Most of this reporting was done in Philadelphia, and one issue, for example, included a 2-page summary of George Washington's address to the citizens of Philadelphia on December 9, 1790. In this speech, Washington discussed the economy of the fledgling republic and emphasized the need to achieve economic independence and political stability. Another later issue, for example, published in La Gaceta, reported that, I quote, agriculture, commerce, industry are all making important progress in the United States. The great number of goods produced in these states that are offered to European markets is clear proof of this. The publisher of the Gaceta de Madrid might have thought that a positive depiction of the United States aligned well with the basic precepts of Bourbon reformism in Spain, which was a program that emphasized agricultural activities, liberal commercial policies, education of the population, and the development of new industries. But from the perspective of the Spanish American readers, these reports might have a different meaning. The economic progress of the United States could easily have been understood as a direct result of the American achievement of full independence from the British Empire. The political message contained in these Spanish periodicals then could be interpreted in striking different ways depending on the reader's geographic location or social political background. Spanish publishers and censors in Madrid seem unaware of this possibility despite regular warnings by colonial officials in Cuba or in Caracas that this influx of information could have unexpected outcomes in the American territories. This cover that you see here, this is the Gaceta de Madrid from November 1791, and it was the first time the Spanish newspaper reported on the rebellions in the northern part of Saint-Domingue, of basically the beginning of the Haitian Revolution. Can we see the next slide, please? This is my second story. On the breezy evening of July 25th, 1797, this is 9 years later, a black slave boy was suddenly arrested by officials while crossing a bridge in the port city of La Guaira. And you can see this beautiful image of La Guaira in 1808. The officials demanded that this little boy, the slave of a white Creole from the island of Curacao, repeat the French songs he had been singing on the bridge. The boy, named Joseph, dutifully complied. According to the official report, all of Joseph's songs had the same chorus: "Long live the Republic, long live the liberty, long live equality." Little Joseph, who was likely around 8 years old, innocently commented that his master frequently sent him to houses of friends and family members in La Guaira to sing to them, basically to perform to them. He also added that 2 other slaves from Curacao, Marcos and Domingo, regularly also performed similar songs in the house and semi-public spaces in La Guaira. Astonished and enraged, the officials decided to transcribe word by word the lyrics of the songs that Joseph was singing. Although the officials could not manage to translate all of the lyrics, it was quite clear to them that the boy was singing French revolutionary anthems. The songs contained rather damning lines like "The Republic of Saint Colossus is friendly to the liberty," "Long live the French Republic, French liberty and equality," "Let's go, French citizen, form your troops and march with our cannon," "Come and die for your homeland, France." The officials believed that little Joseph did not sing, and I quote, "with evil intentions," but they considered these songs contained politically dangerous messages that might incite the local population to revolt against the Spanish monarchy. They therefore decided to hold the little boy in custody until they were able to locate his master. Though officials considered the little boy innocent, Joseph's story proved that songs where, I quote, "dangerous revolutionary contents could reach anyone regardless of race, age, or education." Even more frightening for the colonial authorities was the ease with which listeners could reproduce and disseminate these messages. Orality was an incredibly effective medium of communication. In fact, in the Spanish Caribbean, controlling people and their voices proved much more difficult and exhausting for the authorities than controlling books and newspapers. Oral information was far more accessible for people, and it's evident that the Atlantic rumors and Atlantic Revolution jargoning and words were on the mouths of the people. Next slide, please. So this comes, let's see, 1804. So this is almost 7 years after the story of little Joseph. So it was April 24th, 1804, when the Captain General of Venezuela, Manuel Guevara Vasconcelos, sent a written communication to the King of Spain in which he lamented not having detailed information about, I quote, "the unhappy disgraces that had recently taken place in Saint-Domingue." I quote again, "an island that was under the monstrous domination of the blacks," end of quote. He added, however, that he had been able to acquire a paper, a papel, that a person in Caracas had brought to his attention. According to Guevara Vasconcelos, the manuscript offered evidence of the strong union, and I quote, "that existed among different black generals in Saint-Domingue." And it also included, I quote again, "discourses directed to attract and get positive opinions and enthusiasm among the crowds." This paper, he added, shows that they, meaning the black generals, will continue with their same artifices, acts, and concepts that Evil Toussaint sought to promote in the past. But this time, I quote again, they might have more lasting success because they have perfected the operations designed to maintain, I quote, "this miserable island independent and in a state of anarchy." Imploring the King of Spain to share with him his wise advice, Guevara Vasconcelos attached a copy of the mentioned document to his letter. "Liberty or death" were the 2 words with which the document began, to be followed by the date it was proclaimed, January 1st, 1804. The paper that Guevara Vasconcelos was holding in his hands was in fact a complete manuscript copy of the Declaration of Independence of Haiti, translated into Spanish. Proclaimed by the Haitian leader, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and signed by 37 military officers who swore to renounce to France, this Declaration of Independence of Haiti not only marked the end of 15 years of revolution, but signified the birth of the first Black nation in the Americas, one whose Black leader firmly declared equality among the races and the definitive abolition of slavery. Guevara Vasconcelos was not able, perhaps not willing, to recognize the tremendous relevance of this document, but he was aware of the danger of its circulation represented in the Spanish American territories. The document surely sparked mixed and contrasting feelings of either sympathy or horror in the international community. But for Guevara Vasconcelos, however, seemed unaware of the significance and implication of this document that he repeatedly characterized as a simple paper. For him, it seemed to be one more example of those seditious written texts originating in the turbulent Caribbean that had been circulated among the population of mixed race and Black people in Venezuela, especially inviting them to join a revolutionary cause. So these three stories are, in my opinion, evidence that between 1780s and 1808, the circulation of texts and rumors about the Atlantic revolutions, including the America as in the first case, the French as in the second story, and the Haitian as in the third story, in the Spanish Caribbean dramatically increased, exacerbating fears of racial confrontation and political conflict among colonial agents, but also feeding the hopes of an increasingly discontent population of color that were fiercely questioning colonial government. Let me see, by the close of the 18th century, it became very clear for officials in the Spanish America, especially in the Spanish Caribbean region, that the Americas was not a perfect extension of Spain. The social racial complexity, its dependency on slave labor, the economic struggles, and its open and immediate exposure to the theaters of revolution required different measures of social control and strategies to manage public information. Ideas of liberty and equality from the Atlantic revolutions reached the towns and ports dispersed in the Caribbean basin, and the turmoil of Saint-Domingue and Guadeloupe compounded local political anxieties and hopes. Colonial officials and white elites in Venezuela, in Cuba, in New Granada, in Santo Domingo began to pay more attention to the actions and words of the mixed race population, of the free Black population, enslaved people, and to reconsider the relationship with these subordinated groups. At the same time, these officials and elites increased their vigilance, trying to isolate the population from these external influence and sources of information. Such controlling actions, however, became very difficult because news about the revolutions flooded the region and sparked the interest of the common people, especially people of color, who began to use this language of revolution to represent their discontent and also to challenge their increasing interest in new political projects. With that, I'm just finished, and I'm going to pass it to Professor Greenberg.
Thanks, Christina. Hi, everyone. I also want to thank very much the Newberry Library for putting up together this really wonderful exhibit that I wish I were able to see in person. And also for those two panels that are being incredible, interesting, and also enlightening about what it was called in 19th century a revolution. And I'm saying that because I think that I'm a historian of Brazil, and I'm actually right now in Brazil, in Rio. And I guess that once we think about how Brazil fits into a discussion like that, the first question is, can we consider what happened in Brazil during independence or at Brazilian independence as a revolution? So basically what I'm going to do in my few minutes is try to engage with the idea of revolution and independence in Brazil at this time. And I'm saying that because, of course, there's a lot to discuss in the connections between Brazilian political movements and its connections to Spanish America, to the Caribbean, to the US. It's Brazil's bicentennial of independence next year. So here, this has been a huge topic. And my question about whether we're talking about a revolution refers to the main narrative about Brazilian independence, which is Brazil was the only country that was, after the independence, not only remained a kingdom, but also became an empire. The Republic wasn't proclaimed until 1889. And the empire was ruled by Dom Pedro I, which was the son of the Dom João VI, the King of Portugal. So in fact, Brazilian independence was very unusual in many other ways. Even before, in 1808, in a context that was already described by my fellow panelists, fleeing from a French invasion of Portugal, the Portuguese court moved from Lisbon to Rio. So this was, in fact, the only case in which a capital of an empire, a European empire, was moved to the Americas. And Rio de Janeiro became the port and became the capital of the whole Portuguese empire from 1808 on, even being a colony. That didn't mean independence, of course, but it meant that in some years later, oh, sorry, if you could just show my my PowerPoint, then those, yes, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. So here we are in the second, 1815, Brazil was officially recognized as part of the United Kingdom of Portugal. So not a colony anymore. In 1821, when a constitution revolt started in the Portuguese city of Porto, Dom João, the king, returned from Brazil, from Rio, to Portugal, leaving his son, Dom Pedro I, in Brazil. And in 1822, following the requests by local planters, all slaveholders, and by merchants, many of them slave traders, that wanted to prevent Brazil from becoming a colony again, or to be in that situation of dependence again, Dom Pedro I declared Brazilian independence. So that context is absolutely different from the ones we have just heard about. And this is pretty much the official narrative of Brazilian independence. That narrative that I just repeated to you is the official narrative that hides the struggles for citizenship and also the regional movements in Brazil in defense of republicanism that happened from the 1810s to the 1830s. So if we're gonna, so the easy answer, if that Brazil had Brazilian independence was a revolution, no, but at the same time, it's a mistake, a big mistake, not to look at the revolutionary movements that happened at this time and what we can really consider revolutionary at this point. We're talking about the biggest slave society in the Americas, growing, as Caitlin said before, and also one that the ties between slaveholders, slave traders, and the state were pretty strong. But while that was happening, in 1823 and 1824, while the first constitution was being discussed, that was released in 1824, there was a huge debate about whether indigenous persons and enslaved individuals were considered Brazilians and whether they would become citizens of Brazil. And that discussion happened in the light of Haitian Revolution and its effects in Brazil, especially in the area that we call the Northeast, from up North Maranhão to Bahia, as those were the areas where the liberal movements and Republican ideas were stronger. So this was a time, I mean, it's much after the Haitian Revolution, but it's also a time where the ideas about the Haitian Revolution were circulating very strongly in those areas. And lots of Afro-Brazilians were accused of spreading those ideas around. So there was, I don't know how deep those movements were, but we know that the fear of the slaveholders was something that really prevented those movements of granting citizenship to most indigenous and also enslaved individuals to really become true. With the growing conversation about liberty, several groups of enslaved individuals started to claim, also as happened in Spanish America, that liberty should mean not only political independence, but also individual freedom from slavery. That claim resonated among the elite as, again, a lighting of gunpowder. Already fearing a potential development of a movement such as the Haitian Revolution here, they made sure to prevent those claims. So the Constitution stated that enslaved individuals were not citizens of the country, and even more complicated, also stated that African-born individuals, and Brazil at this time had the biggest African-born population outside of Africa, even if freed, they could never, ever become Brazilian citizens, as Portuguese could immediately. But at the same time, because of the big free and freed population of Brazil at this time, it stated that the descendants of slaves born in Brazil, free or freed, would become citizens of the country and would have the same civil rights as any other citizens. So that situation really made Brazil a very interesting and complicated case during independence. The same constitution that denied rights of nationality to all enslaved persons and denied citizenship rights to all African-born individuals, even the freed ones, didn't have any other racial clauses when it came to Brazilian-born Afro descendants. And that situation was in part the result of the high manumission rate in Brazil. And Brazil had the largest free Afro-descendant population in the Americas at this point, but also was the result of Afro-Brazilian struggles and claims for rights and inclusions since the late 18th century. So I just want to show you an example, and that comes from the case that I studied. So please, the next slide. Thank you. This is a picture of the Proclamation of Independence in Bahia that was that happened in 1823, and that's a celebratory portrait from 1931. And it shows the participation of many Afro descendants in that movement. The one I want to highlight, please, next one, is this man with his hat right in the middle of the detail with a red thing around his neck, which was Antonio Pereira Rebouças. So who is Rebouças? Rebouças is an Afro-Brazilian, born free, poor, self-taught guy that managed to be one of the most famous lawyers in 19th century Brazil. But before that, he was considered a hero of independence. And because of his participation in Bahian independence movement there in 1823. So because of that, he became a member of not a small group that managed to, of Afro-Brazilians that managed to enter Brazilian bureaucracy and the Brazilian state and really claim for more rights. So he became sort of what we could call a vice governor of the province of Sergipe right after independence. But then in 1824, he was fired, accused to promote Haitian ideas. And I'm just bringing up his case to show that even though there were a possibility for social mobility and political mobility from those Afro-Brazilians that managed to participate in the independence and to be recognized as heroes. But there was also a very strong movement from the slave holders that tried to prevent this from happening. And the common accusation today, we'll just say racism. At this time, the accusation was of promote Haitian ideas or promote revolution. So we're really talking about a time where we could see revolutionary movements, but also a time where we could really see anti-Haitian, anti-revolutionary movements. I don't believe Rebouças was a promoter of Haitian ideas, unfortunately. But he lost his position because of that. And then in the 1830s, was back to politics, now a member of the House of Representatives, advocating that all restrictions to full citizenship to men of color like him should be revoked. So even though in the Constitution there was no regulations that restricted Afro-Brazilian rights, in practice, several restrictions remain, especially connected to the occupation of public positions. And what is interesting is that in the 1830s, Rebouças lost practically all claims that he defended in his public life. He became very isolated. And at a certain point in the late 1830s, he was basically alone in the House of Representatives, bringing up those claims, and also being in a very open way, object of racist attacks, not just from the other fellows representatives, but also from the audience who would go to the sessions and who would call him different names and say that he didn't have the right to be there. So again, the 1820s and the 1830s in Brazil were a time where probably it's the first time where social movements based on racial equality really gained the public discussion. But it's also a time when the opposition and the movements to restrain that got really, really strong. And it's interesting because that doesn't go necessarily with abolitionism in Brazil. So Rebouças was not an abolitionist. I mean, his son was one of the most famous abolitionists in the country, André Rebouças, but he wasn't. He wasn't an abolitionist then. He was a defender of the ending of the African slave trade, but he wasn't against slavery. So what I'm trying to point out here too is that when we get closer to that historical context, we really need to understand, and it's not easy, I think, nowadays, that you can be conservative when we look at him with the eyes of the whole hemisphere. Now, a hemispheric perspective, we could call Rebouças a conservative man. He was a liberal for Brazilian standards, and he was revolutionary in the terms that he was a defender of equality among free men, but he wasn't against abolition of slavery. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to go through those different ways to think about political activism in those different places and see the differences, but also the similarities in order to find the connections, but also to understand what it meant to be revolutionary at this point. And by then I want to finish with the last slide. I'm just saying that bringing to our present now in Brazil, that it's unfortunate but necessary to say that some of Antônio Pereira Rebouças' demands and struggles are not fulfilled yet. His loneliness as a member of House of Representatives that were seen by several of his colleagues as someone that could not be there still resonates today. 3 years ago, one of Brazilian most important advocates for Afro-Brazilian and LGBT rights, Rio's councilman Marielle Franco, was killed. Her death was celebrated by several people, including other councilmen. Until now, the crime remained unsolved. So with those connections between past and present, I stop here and I go back to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Kayla, and thanks to Laurent and Christina for your wonderful presentations. This was also, just like the first panel, there are wonderful connections and threads to pull upon for all three of these presentations. And I have a bunch of places to start while people in the audience start putting their questions in the chat, and feel free to do that if you're listening. Put those questions in the Q&A and we will get to them. I'm going to start with a question that I didn't plan on, but I resonated through all three talks, so I want to start with it. And that's sort of about, well, it's about information and the sort of media scape of the places that you study. Laurent's wonderful comment about the new verb that was coined through the declaration got me thinking about this and thinking about orality and documents in this period. I wonder if each of you could speak about sort of how information how got passed around in this period, how information led into the revolutions or the independence or emancipation struggles in your areas of study, growing and changing. Whoever wants to start here should chime in.
I'll just say quickly, because Christina, I love that the fact of the song. Well, all of the three examples are so interesting, but notably that last one made me think about the fact that, and Duke also not that long ago acquired a kind of handwritten manuscript from Haiti of the revolution of the Declaration, and what I think it makes clear is how much the written, handwritten things that we have are traces of orality, right? You know, in a sense, they're kind of like people are reading these and then recopying them, and so much more. It just kind of reminds us that actually it's the spoken word, I guess, that's transmitting, and then song, as you described, I think is a great example. Theater, other kinds of forms that and I think that whole world is really important to consider. Of course, it's harder to study than the written, obviously, because the archives left are, but I actually think that in many ways it's probably more important for people sort of constituting revolutionary consciousness. And so I think as historians, you know, that's I think a movement that's happening now is to really try to understand, obviously going back to Julia Scott's work, which was kind of argued about the centrality of spoken word, but that would be my first quick response. Thank you both for your presentations too.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Laura. And I think for historians, I think is key to understand that, you know, once you learn to read and write, that doesn't mean that you stop talking. It's like the opposite. You just basically integrate that new media to the way that you express yourself. And, you know, if we think about the historians 50 years from now, 100 years from now, they're going to start looking at Twitter and Facebook because that's another media that we're using to talk about politics. And so for me, it's crucial that we historians, although in a way we are victims of our sources because we are attached to the written character of our sources, we need to understand that those are just, you know, expressions of something else that was going on that is also quite, you know, is orally. So I have been trying to give more importance, first of all, to the manuscripts, because sometimes we, you know, the printing is there and people assume that everything that's printed is what is circulating. Well, in fact, you know, even though there were printing press or other places without printing press, which was the case of Venezuela, you know, how powerful the manuscripts forms were is amazing. And again, this is a declaration of the independence of Haiti that came into the hands of the Captain General, and it's only 3 months later. I mean, it's completely translated. It's in April, right? So it's only 4 months later, and that speaks about, you know, also the velocity, how fast people will take a document, translate it, put it on a paper, and send it to, in this case, to Caracas. I haven't been able to identify how it arrived in Caracas, but it's quite interesting to see that it's already in the hands of the Captain General, who's, by the way, not or as I said, not willing to recognize, but not aware of the significance of the political significance of the document.
Yeah, I just want to add that, I mean, as Nora and Christina had already said, that we are always trying to find within the written document signs of orality. So it really depends on what kind of source you're looking at. And here, I think the main ones are the judicial sources, the several lawsuits where you can have, of course, not exactly the voice of anyone, but we can get close to what was said at some point and at some area. And then the power of manuscripts, especially sources that were not made to last. Because some sources are made to last, right? Reports and all kinds of printed sources, but the ones who were, and even lawsuits, but the ones that we just find, you know, by luck, those are the ones who probably give us the best sense of what you're talking about orality and about organized thoughts. And then we can find more than we did before as historians.
Thank you. A quick sort of factual question for Kayla that came up in the chat. The very powerful last image you showed. Can you just translate for that? Does it say who was sent to kill her? Is that what it says?
No, who ordered the killing?
Who ordered the killing?
Yeah,
Okay.
Who is behind, you know, the killer?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's the image that the question was about.
Yeah.
So what it says is who ordered the killing. Okay, a question from Mason. I'm wondering, is there any work that's been done that you recommend that considers revolutionary movements as part of colonial history and not so much as independence movements for liberation from colonization? After all, the people engaged in these movements seem on the whole to have come from elsewhere, or at least their ancestors. And most, if not all of them, wouldn't have been in these places were it not for colonial powers. Movements that are truly liberating from colonization would seem to need the inclusion of indigenous peoples and what they suffered because of colonization. So can you comment on that in your different contexts?
A quick thing's come to mind, and I'm sorry, did you want to say something, Christina? For me is the whole history of kind of royalism and evocations of kings by indigenous people, by enslaved people, so which are clearly not really independence movements, right? In a certain way, right? They're often actually articulating they're articulating demands based on calling on a king against other local enemies, right? Or kind of, so that's a context in which you have, it's very much sort of embedded in the imperial landscape about different kind of power sources. I mean, I think the point about the indigenous is totally vital. In the Caribbean, obviously, you know, interestingly, both in Haiti, there is a kind of proclamation of indigeneity. The name Haiti is the indigenous name. They return to the indigenous name. And there are ways in which the kind of indigenous is evoked. And then perhaps more potently, the story of the Garifuna or the Black Caribs in the Eastern Caribbean, who are a community of indigenous African people mixed together, who kind of essentially fight for their autonomy and freedom in the 18th century and get deported. And so there are kind of, I mean, that's one case. There are cases obviously where the indigenous kind of communities participate in this era that we could maybe make more central. That's maybe just a partial answer to the question.
Yeah, I can also think about a couple of examples that I think are similar to what Lauren is describing, where we can think about the Tupac Amaru rebellion in the case of the Indian region, where is a rebellion that, you know, it was thought in like a revolutionary proportions, but it's not necessarily anti-monarchy or anti-Spain, but it's anti-local governments, anti-the colonial government. So it's anti-colonial, not necessarily anti-monarchical, and that, you know, connects with the Comunero rebellions in the northern part of the Andean region. And if I have to think about kind of a work that I recommend, would be Marcela Echeverry's work on royalism in Popayan. I think that's an excellent example to look into, you know, understanding royalism within this context. I think that would be a great work to look at.
That's just an added little interesting point is that at one point Dessalines calls the Army of Liberation in Haiti the Army of the Incas. You know, they actually kind of ally themselves with, I think, with Tupac Amaru as like an example. So.
Yeah, and I mean, going along the same lines, I just want to add that, I mean, since the 17th century, there were claims and demands that, I mean, couldn't be called rights, but maybe today would call rights from military groups that were formed by indigenous and also enslaved people in the areas that became very supportive of Republican movements in the northeast of Brazil, especially Pernambuco. But those claims, so if you look at the claims that we could describe as royalist claims in the 17th and 18th century, lots of letters wrote to the king and all those things, they lack the language of rights that came to the discussion in the 1820s. So I think that, there is a shift that I think it's very important. That doesn't have to do necessarily with this disconnection between colonial and independence, but the inclusion of the language of rights as rights, differently than before, really changed not exactly the claims, but it changed the way they were understood. And that made really when you think of the word equality, when you think of the word merit, which was very important at this point, it really shifted the political meanings of the claims that were in some cases the same as were being made since the 17th century.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Another question that came up about the Haitian Revolution in particular and its connections to the Americas as a whole in this era. So discussions on the Haitian Revolution are usually followed by a mention of its unrepeatability, yet repeatedly through the Latin American revolutions and independence struggles, we see slaves and free people of color inject themselves into these revolutions and colonial conflicts to influence their outcomes, much like the Haitians did. So the question is, do we need to change our understanding of the probability or feasibility of slave revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries? How much should we consider the Haitian Revolution an unusual event? And should we be saying that other revolutions mimicked parts of the Haitian Revolution? Probably best to start with Laurent here and go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think, what I like to do is sort of try to get into the sort of the vision of the people we're studying, right? And obviously the many, many people in different contexts who are inspired by the Haitian Revolution and tried to repeat it, thought it was repeatable. In other words, so Aponte in Cuba, Gabriel in Virginia, later Nat Turner. I mean, we can multiply the examples, right? They obviously thought it was, they considered that they could use this example. John Brown actually essentially was drawing on the examples of the Haitian Revolution, and in some ways actually succeeded in doing what he intended to do. But there's a kind of way in which, so I think it was seen as repeatable, and at the same time, it was seen as repeatable by all those people who worked really, really hard to make sure that it wasn't repeated through the repressive mechanisms that we have talked about, right? So in a sense, it's almost like it's clear repeatability sort of shaped the whole history of the 19th century in that sense, right? The fact that it could happen elsewhere. And I also think that there are ways in which, you can think about the US Civil War, you can think about other cases in which, enslaved people or people of African descent played completely decisive fundamental roles as, not the same as the Haitian Revolution, because each event is unique, of course, but in some broader sense, I think, thinking from the Haitian Revolution about these other events helps you kind of think them differently too. And certainly the Latin American, all the work that the people on this panel have done, and that Christina and Kayla and others have done, are kind of, examples of how important it is to think the Latin American stories through the kinds of engagements you're mentioning. So.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I completely agree with Laurent, and I also wanted to add that for the white Creole elites in Latin America, it was not only, I mean, they imagined they could be, repeated, and that's why they were afraid, and they tried to create kind of more mechanism of control. But on the other hand, I see like a two-pronged process in which they're also trying to address discontent and trying to open negotiations and communication with the people of color, especially, if you're thinking of Venezuela or Colombia, where New Granada, where you have 45% of the populations are mixed race, are pardos, then they at some point the white Creole elite have to imagine that they need to open spaces of negotiation and political struggle with them. So it opened, in one hand, there's more repression and control, but also more spaces to negotiate and talk about what kind of measures it can create to calm the spirits of rebellion among in Venezuela in particular. I've seen that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to add those two things, which is a really interesting question, because I think basically for two reasons. One is that in some ways, all revolutions are unusual, and they're not, they cannot be repeated, even though the outcomes may be similar. When you think about a revolution, it can be seen as a unique phenomenon. On the other hand, you never know when a revolution is starting, because those things are not planned in a way that, okay, now we are starting this revolution here. And in some cases, when it's planned, it doesn't really, like the Malays revolt in Brazil in 1835 in Bahia, that was carefully planned, didn't go anywhere, just lasted for 5 hours, a couple of hours, and then the repression was huge. So that unpredictability of the revolutions and the uniqueness is something that we need to think about when we go back to that context. And at the same time, when we think and we reflect about those movements nowadays, then we can try to understand why a revolution like the Haitian Revolution never happened in the same way in other places. So it's really, what I'm trying to say is that when we ask a question like that, which is really interesting, I'm asking this thinking about with my 21st century mind, and then we'll have a specific answer to understand, okay, what was possible here and there, what was the repression, and what were the conditions. But then when we look back and try to think, in any possible ways, with the mind of someone living in that context, we might think about inspirations, as Laurent said, less influence, but also circulation of ideas. But really, we don't know what we are going through. So it was basically those 2 points about that.
Great, thank you. Thank you all. We're going to take one last question here, which is a wonderful concluding point, and then we'll wrap up. A question came through about the various ways in which colonialism and coloniality have tended to reinscribe themselves in the post-colonial Americas. So essentially, what to do about the neo-colonial condition in the Americas. Whoever wants to start.
Shall I jump in? I'm sorry, we just keep doing the same order, but I will, unless somebody else. I think it's a really important point. I think the first thing just starts by naming it, right? In other words, there are ways in which, of course, there was a kind of decolonization in the early 19th century, and other ways in which there wasn't, right? Obviously, for indigenous people into the present day, it's still a colonial order. Of course, the United States then embarks on its own kind of colonial imperial projects throughout the region, et cetera. So I think we can start by kind of trying to name the ways in which it's certainly not a kind of easy progression. It's more of like a layered multiple forms of sometimes liberation and sometimes colonialism or coloniality that are kind of interlocking, right? And I think that's the kind of, I recently translated a work by Jean Casimir, who's a French, Haitian thinker, but it was from French to English. And really, really trying to think through how much kind of colonial categories continue to shape even Haitian thinkers. So I think, anyway, there's a lot of work going on there to kind of think not only historically, but also about what categories we use and how they might continue to vehicle these colonial ideas and what we might do differently.
Yeah, I just would add that for me it could be quite interesting to see how even the Creole leaders of independence in Latin America, they were concerned about the impossibilities or the challenges of facing independence like as a whole, right? They knew that once they got rid of Spain, there were other actors in the global sphere that were interested in dealing with Latin America. So you can see Simón Bolívar being preventing about the interests of the United States, or how the British would be interested in getting into Spanish America. So they knew that even after these 15 years or 20 years of war in Latin America, the independence as a whole was not achievable in the long run, because there were other challenges that would put, that the danger of coloniality was always there, and they knew it. So that for me is kind of an interesting thing to look at when you look into their discourses and writings.
Well, in the Brazilian case, the persistence of the colonial order is very, very visible. That Brazil remained an empire, remained a monarchy, and kept slavery in the base of its hierarchy. So I guess from the end of the monarchy in 1889 on, what we see is the reproduction of the colonial hierarchies that some of them last until nowadays. So the fact that Brazil internalized the racial hierarchies that were part of the colonial order in terms of indigenous and Afro-Brazilian people throughout the 20th century, and even when you look at the indigenous population, really not recognizing its existence until very recent, is very much talks very much about the persistence of colonialism. So nowadays, I can just say that the persistence of racism is probably a very strong racism. It's probably the most visible of our colonial persistences. And I don't want to finish without saying that even though in the first 15 years of the 21st century, a lot was done to reduce the coloniality of Brazil, I think that what we watch now, one of the possible ways to understand Bolsonaro's election and everything that is going on here, is the same kind of movement against the expansion of rights that we saw in the 1830s and in the 1820s and 30s. We are in some ways seeing now people defending the remaining of our racial and social hierarchies and coloniality as part of Brazilian society.
Well, I think we will have to stop there. This was a wonderful conversation, and we could keep talking all afternoon, I think, but we have to stop. So thank you so much to Laurent and Christina and Kayla for a really rich, thought-provoking discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to Karin to wrap us up here.
Thank you, Will, and thank you all of our speakers today. We certainly have only scratched the surface of this whole fascinating topic. And again, we thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for its support of this program. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. A recording of this program will be available soon on the Newberry's YouTube channel. Newberry Public Programs remain free and open to all. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to events at the Newberry, hopefully soon as it's safe to do so. Until next time, thank you.